The servants always moved quieter in the East Wing. I noticed it within the first week of living in Ashenvale Keep, the way footsteps softened near my corridor, the way voices dropped half an octave when they passed my door. Not out of respect, out of something older than that. Pity, maybe, or the particular kind of careful silence people reserve for rooms that hold things broken beyond fixing. I had been mated to King Kalen Voss for 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days. I had eaten breakfast alone for 4 years, 9 months and 6 days. I stopped counting after that. What was the point? The math didn't change anything. The East Wing remained the East Wing. His wing, broad and warm with the smell of cedarwood fires and old leather, remained his. The distance between us was not measured in hallways. It was measured in something that had no name in any language I had ever learned, something that lived in the chest just beneath the sternum and ached on cold mornings, and on the new moon, and every single time I heard his voice carrying through stone walls I was never meant to hear through. My name is Sira. I was 22 when I was brought to Ashenvale as the Alpha King's fated mate, chosen by the bond itself, that ancient, wordless thing that runs deeper than blood, older than crowns. I had no title before his. I had a village and a small life and a mother who smelled of chamomile and a dog named Pip who slept at my feet and knew nothing of politics or kings or the cold geometry of royal halls. I was 22, and I was brought to a man who looked at me across the great hall as if I had appeared in the middle of a battle he had already been losing for a very long time, with the particular expression of a soldier who has just heard enemy reinforcements arrive. Not cruel, not unkind, just exhausted in a way that went down to his marrow. He had done his duty. He had acknowledged the bond in front of his council. He had given me chambers, a title, a household staff, and the East Wing, which was beautiful and well-appointed and very, very far from his own rooms. And then Kalen Voss, Alpha King of the Ashenvale territories, had retreated from me as if retreat were the most disciplined thing a man could do. For 5 years, I had tried to understand it. I stopped trying somewhere around year 3. I had rebuilt myself in the East Wing. That was the only honest way to say it. When I arrived, I was the girl from the village with chamomile-scented memories and no idea how to address a duke or walk through a court without looking like I was apologizing for the space I occupied. I fumbled my vowels in formal address. I knocked over a glass at my first council dinner and went scarlet to the ears, while 12 pairs of eyes found something else to look at. Kalen had not looked elsewhere. That had been the strange thing, the one thing that refused to fit the shape of the story I told myself about him. He had watched me through the rest of that dinner, not with pity, not with embarrassment, with something careful and complicated behind his gray eyes that I had eventually learned to stop trying to read. It was easier not to read it. It was easier to become someone who did not need to. By year 2, I was competent. By year 3, I was respected. By year 5, I had quietly become the person in this court that people went to when they needed something done with precision and without fanfare. I managed the East Wing staff with the kind of calm authority that came not from a title, but from actually knowing people's names and remembering their mothers had been ill and their youngest child had just learned to walk. I had worked with the court healer on a new triage protocol for the border villages. I had written, quietly and without credit, 3 of the formal land treaties that now sat in the royal archive under Kalen's seal. I had built something, a life, a smaller, quieter version of the life I might have had if the bond had never found me, or if the man at the center of it had been able to look at me for more than 30 consecutive seconds without something closing down behind his eyes. I had built it with the specific, methodical care of someone reassembling themselves from the inside out. Like cables reconnected one by one. Like a system rebooting after a hard shutdown. The East Wing had 12 rooms, and I knew every one of them. The morning room caught the best light in the whole castle. I had learned this by accident in year 1, and had made it my primary working space from that point on. The library alcove off my sitting room held perhaps 300 volumes, and I had read 240 of them. The narrow staircase at the far end led to a rooftop balcony that looked north toward the forest edge, and in summer I went there on evenings when the bond was particularly active, and I needed sky around me instead of walls. The east wing had been designed as a guest quarter, a courtesy wing, the kind of space you give someone you wish to house comfortably and keep pleasantly contained. I had refused to be contained. I had simply expanded to fill it. I knew every member of my household staff by name, by temperament, by the small anxieties that made them show up to work tight-faced on particular mornings. My housekeeper, Marta, had a son at the border training camps, and I had arranged, quietly and without making a matter of it, for the communication protocols between the border posts and the capital to include a forwarding path for family letters. Her face on the morning she received the first one had told me something I had not been able to put into words. That doing good work in a small space was not the same as being small. I had structured my days with the same precision I brought to everything. Morning correspondence, reviewed and drafted before the household woke. An hour with the court healer twice a week, working on the resource allocation model for the northern clinics. Afternoons divided between the library and the sessions, where I made myself available to East Wing petitioners, the tenant farmers and small tradespeople who technically fell under my jurisdiction as Lady of the East, and who had learned, by word of mouth, that the Alpha King's mate listened and acted rather than receiving and forgetting. I had 12 cases pending from the last quarter. 3 had been resolved. 4 were in progress. 5 were waiting on documentation from the Regional Records Office, which I had written to twice and was preparing to write to a third time with considerably less patience. The Alpha King knew about the petitioner sessions. I had submitted formal reports through his chief of staff. They had been acknowledged in writing by the same. We had not spoken directly about them. We had not spoken directly about most things. The court had long since stopped watching to see if the arrangement would change. They had accepted it with the pragmatic adaptation of people who understand that the powerful do what they do and the rest navigate accordingly. A few had tried, early on, to probe the situation, the younger courtiers whose curiosity outpaced their discretion, the council wives who understood political information as currency. I had learned to be pleasantly unrevealing, to answer questions about my arrangement with Kaelan in ways that disclosed nothing and communicated everything necessary, that I was not to be pitied, that my position was secure, that the East Wing was managed territory and they were visitors in it. What I did not communicate, and what was true, was the specific weight of the bond on nights when everything was quiet, and the only sound was stones settling and rain on windows, and the distant sound of voices in rooms I was not in. The weight of a thing designed for closeness being kept at a distance by the deliberate architecture of a man who had turned distance into discipline. I had stopped being angry at the distance around year 3. I had started instead being curious. There were things about Kaelan Voss that I knew secondhand, the way you come to know a landscape you have only seen in maps. I knew his reputation before I arrived, the Alpha King who had ended the Western War in 3 years, by being the kind of general who did not celebrate victories, who moved through the aftermath of battle as if the cost were always present to him and always to be weighed. I knew the court stories. The Eastern Baron who had tried to present a falsified land survey in council and found himself quietly but completely removed from any position of relevance within a fortnight, not through dramatics, but through the silent, systematic withdrawal of access that constituted real power. I knew that he worked longer hours than anyone in the castle and had for years, and that his closest thing to a personal indulgence was a specific Calawan whiskey that he had delivered quarterly and kept in the locked cabinet in his study. I knew these things the way you know them, when someone's life runs parallel to yours through walls and reports and second-hand accounts. What I knew directly was less orderly. I knew the way his voice sounded when he was not performing composure, which I had heard, rarely, through the wrong walls at the wrong moments. Lower than his counsel voice. The cadence of someone speaking without monitoring the sound of themselves. Twice I had heard him laugh that way, and both times I had stood very still with one hand against the stone, and done something I was not prepared to name. I knew the way the bond registered him. At proximity, the council table, the formal occasions when we occupied the same room, the bond was a sustained hum at the base of everything, like a note too low to hear but present in the chest. At distance, across the castle, it was quieter, manageable. A background frequency I had learned to file away the way you file chronic, familiar discomfort. Noted, not acted upon, present always. On the mornings when something hard had happened in his work, dispatches from the border, difficult decisions in council, the bond registered a quality to his presence that I did not know what to do with. Not pain exactly. The particular atmosphere of a man carrying weight with practiced stoicism, the weight so familiar he no longer adjusted his posture around it. I had, on those mornings, felt it through the wall and set down whatever I was working on and sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with weather. I did not tell anyone this. There was no one to tell. I had, over 5 years, made something close to a friend in the court healer Thessaly, who was a woman of 50 with practical hands and a precise mind, and the specific quality of attention that made people tell her things they had not planned to say. We had developed our working relationship into something warmer than professional, over long afternoons with supply lists and case files between us. She did not ask about the Alpha King. I thought she probably understood the shape of the situation and had made a decision not to press at it. Once, at the end of a late session, she had looked at me over a cup of tea and said, "You are one of the most competent people in this castle, Sira. I want you to know I think that." I had said thank you. She had said, "I want you to know it because I suspect no one else here has told you, and I think you should hear it from someone." I had thought about that for a long time afterward, about the East Wing and the files, and the careful methodical work of building a life in the space that had been allocated to me. About whether competence was consolation, or whether it was something different, whether I had made it a replacement for what was absent, or whether I had genuinely found in it what I needed. I thought it was both things. I thought that was all right. The night everything changed had been an ordinary night. It was the deep of a late autumn, the 3rd week of rain that had been going since the first cold snap. Not a dramatic rain, not storm, not thunder, just the persistent, steady kind that settles in over a landscape and makes itself at home. The kind that makes the inside of a stone castle smell of itself, of old mortar and fire ash and centuries of occupation. I had been sitting at the writing desk in my rooms past the 2nd bell, working through the correspondence backlog. The district chiefs of the Southern Territories had submitted their seasonal reports, and the regional water rights dispute had flared again. The Calloway family and the Marin village elders were writing me separately, and in increasingly pained language, each certain the other was acting in bad faith. I had read both sets of letters twice, and formed a view that both parties were partly right and wholly intransigent, and that what the situation required was a formal agreement with specific seasonal provisions and a penalty clause. I had been drafting the framework for that agreement. It would go to the council, eventually, under whichever appropriate seal was deemed necessary. I had stopped caring about attribution somewhere around year 2. The fire had gone to coals. I had been going to rebuild it, but the work had caught me, and I had not yet moved. A lamp burned at my elbow, amber and close, making the writing desk a small island of warmth in the darkened room. The rain against the stone windows had the quality of white noise that I had come to associate with good working nights. Insulating, rhythmic, the world outside drawn close and quiet. I was not, in that moment, thinking about the mate bond. I had learned to relegate it to the background of my awareness the way you relegate the sound of your own breathing, present always, necessary, not requiring attention. I was thinking about penalty clauses and the specific legal distinctions between seasonal rights and perpetual easements. I heard footsteps. My hand did not pause on the page. My heartbeat did not change. I heard footsteps in the East Wing corridor, the night steward's round, I assumed, without lifting my head. And then I lifted my head. Because those footsteps were not the night steward. The rhythm was different. The weight of them was different. The night steward moved with the practiced efficiency of a man doing a route he had walked 500 times, a certain mechanical ease in the step sequence. These were different. These were the footsteps of a man walking deliberately, consciously, with a quality I could only describe as someone climbing toward something they had decided to climb toward. I had heard these footsteps once before. I set down my quill. The footsteps stopped outside my door. There was a pause, long enough to be deliberate. Long enough for a man standing in a corridor to have a conversation with himself that I could not hear. The mate bond, which I had filed away in the background approximately 3 minutes ago, came forward with the specific insistence of an alarm system that has detected something significant and intends to be noticed about it. His presence, directly outside my door, the proximity of him like pressure, like heat. He knocked. 3 knocks, measured, even-spaced, not the knock of authority. The knock of a man who wants to be let in and understands this is not the same as demanding entry. I stood. My legs worked. I crossed to the door. I was aware, in a remote and analytical part of my mind, that my hair was not pinned. It had come loose an hour ago and I had not bothered, and that my gown was a working gown, ink blue, practical, not the kind of thing you would choose to wear for a significant moment. I did not stop to change any of this. Something in me understood that this moment should not be prepared for. That preparation would be another kind of wall. I opened the door. Kalen Voss stood in the corridor of the East Wing at the second bell of the night wearing no crown, no formal coat, just a dark tunic and trousers and bare feet on cold stone. And he looked at me the way a man looks at something he has spent years constructing elaborate reasons not to look at directly. His hair was disheveled. Not in the artful way of courts, but genuinely, as if he had been lying down and then suddenly was not. There was a quality to his stillness that reminded me of the ocean just before a storm turns, everything held, everything gathered. He was 35. He had been 30 when I arrived. The years had not softened his face. It was still all controlled tension and sharp angles, still those gray eyes that carried weather in them. But there were lines at the corners now that had not been there before, and they had come from the specific work of holding a particular expression for a very long time. He looked exhausted, not tired in the way of a long day, exhausted in the way of a very long fight. "Ciro," he said. Just that. Just my name, said with the particular care of a man trying out a word he has been practicing quietly, trying to remember how his mouth first learned it. I said, "It is very late." It was a remarkably inadequate thing to say. It was all I had. "I know." He did not move from the doorway. His jaw worked once, a brief involuntary thing. May I come in?" Something in my chest did a thing I could not name. Not warmth, not anger. Something that occupied the same territory as both, pressing against the inside of my ribs, jostling. 5 years of managed distance condensing into the specific sensation of a man standing in bare feet outside your door at the second bell asking permission. I stepped back from the doorway. He crossed the threshold. The moment he entered my rooms, the mate bond, that thing I had spent 3 years learning to quiet, to push to the periphery of my awareness the way you push a lamp toward the edge of a table, surged so completely that I had to press my thumbnail hard into my palm just to have something physical to hold. His presence in my space, after 5 years, was an utter recalibration of everything. The room rearranged itself around him without permission. I heard him draw a slightly uneven breath. He had felt it too. Good, I thought, with a sharpness that surprised me. At least something in this room is finally being honest. He did not sit down, neither did I. We stood near the fireplace where the coals had mostly gone gray, a few feet apart, and I watched him try to begin sentences and abandon them. I recognized the process, not because I knew him well exactly, but because I had done the same thing many times in my head, drafting things to say to him on the rare occasions I saw him in rooms we shared. Across council tables, across the width of formal dinners, at the quarterly ceremonies where we occupied the same dais for 90 minutes and spoke to everyone in the room except each other. "I owe you an explanation," he said at last. "You owe me nothing. I meant it to come out neutral. It did not." His eyes came to mine. "That isn't true. I have managed 5 years without one." "I know that." He said it quietly with no flinching. "I know you have. That's part of what I came to say." Outside, the rain continued its patient work against the windows. I said nothing and waited. He crossed to the window. Beyond the glass, the gardens were black shapes against gray, the training ground torches extinguished, the night quiet in the specific way of late autumn rain that has settled in for the long term. He stood with his back half to me, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the kind that has ceased to be muscular tension and become something structural, as if the body has reorganized its load-bearing around a permanent brace. "When you came," he said, "I had been king for 4 years. 2 of those were war. The third was the aftermath, which is a different kind of violence, quieter and more persistent. By the time I sat at that high table and looked across at you, I had," he stopped, tried again. "I had become someone who functioned by cutting off the parts of himself that felt things, not as a philosophy, as a survival mechanism, the kind that becomes permanent if you're not watching." "The rain," I said nothing. "The bond," he said and stopped again. "The bond," I repeated, very quietly. He turned from the window. His face had changed. The complicated thing that lived behind his eyes was no longer behind them. It was simply out, the way a fire comes out when you remove the door of a furnace, suddenly, completely, with heat. "The bond hit me like being lifted from a very great height and dropped," he said. "Like being launched into something I had no preparation for and no equipment to survive. I had spent 4 years constructing a man who did not need to survive things, who managed them, who absorbed shocks and processed contingencies and kept moving." He pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his sternum. "And then there you were. And I had nothing for that. No protocol, no contingency, nothing in the system I had built for myself that could process what the bond was doing." I stood very still. "So I managed you," he said. "I gave you everything I could give without," he stopped. His jaw was tight. "Without falling. I gave you the East Wing and the title and the staff. I maintained the formal arrangement. I thought I was being responsible." "You thought you were protecting the kingdom," I said. He looked at me. "Yes." "From yourself?" "Yes." A pause. "From what I might become if I let myself near what the bond was asking of me." Something in my chest was doing a very slow, careful movement, like tectonic plates, not dramatic, not sudden, just an immense and quiet shift in the underlying structure. "And did that work?" I asked. He said nothing. "Did retreating to the West Wing work, Kaelan?" "No." "Did 5 years of managed distance work?" "No." "Then what did it accomplish?" He held my gaze. "It accomplished," he said, very deliberately, 5 years of you eating breakfast alone. 5 years of you in the East Wing building something without me, out of material I failed to be." His voice was even, but the words had weight to them. the specific weight of a man saying something he has known for a long time, and is only now permitting himself to say out loud. It accomplished absolutely nothing except proving that the management was always about me and never about you. I pressed the nail into my palm. 5 years, I said. I know. 5 years of hearing your voice through walls and reminding myself to breathe. 5 years of sitting at tables where you were present and practicing, very carefully, the art of not looking at your hands when you sign documents because something about the way you hold a pen makes me. I stopped. My voice had done something I had not planned for it to do. I pressed harder. 5 years. And you come here at the second bell in your bare feet with this explanation. He did not flinch from it. Yes, he said, I do. That is not sufficient. No, he said it clearly without defense. It isn't. We looked at each other across the dim room with the fire gone to gray coals, and the rain saying its piece against the windows, and the mate bond between us vibrating with the particular resonance of two tuned instruments being placed finally in the same room. Then what? I said. He crossed the room, not quickly, not rushing, not retreating into urgency the way a man might who wants to override the conversation with action. Slowly. The way a man crosses a room when every step is a genuine choice, when he is not running toward something but choosing it, deliberately, having weighed what it costs. He stopped in front of me, close enough that the warmth of him was palpable, close enough that the bond was no longer background noise but the entire sound of the room. I told myself, he said, very low, that keeping distance was kindness, that a man who had learned to function by cutting off his own feeling would damage what was between us if he got near it. I told myself I was protecting you from something too cold and too controlled to be a mate, from a man who did not know how to be known by anyone. And was that true? It was a version of true, he said. The version that served the conclusion I had already reached. What was the real truth? The real truth, he said, was that I was terrified, specifically with great precision, of what I was feeling when I looked at you across any room, of the bond and what it wanted from me, of the particular terror of being known by the person you are made to be known by. He looked at me steadily, the storm in his eyes no longer something managed behind glass but fully present, fully open, of the chance that if you saw me fully, you would leave. The word dropped into the room. Leave. Kalen Voss, Alpha King, who had ended a war and managed a court and maintained discipline through 4 years of aftermath, was afraid I would leave. He had arranged 5 years of distance to protect himself from the possibility that I might choose to go. I had imagined this conversation, in the particular way you imagine things you have largely stopped hoping for. I had given it many forms over the years. In some versions I was cold and precise. In some I wept, which I did not want to do. In one version, the small terrible hours before dawn, year 2, when the bond had been particularly active for reasons I could not identify, I said nothing at all and simply closed the door. Turned back to the east wing, and closed the door on what had been offered too late. I did not close the door. I thought about the east wing, the cables reconnected one by one, the system rebuilt in silence. The life made from available materials, and how those materials had not included him, and what that had cost, and how the costing had eventually become part of the structure rather than separate from it. I thought about his voice through walls. I thought about his hands on documents I had drafted. I thought about the bond on bad mornings and what I had done with the feeling, which was the same thing I did with all of it. Filed it, continued, kept building. I haven't left, I said. His breath caught, a small involuntary thing. 5 years, I said, and I am still in the east wing. Did you consider that at any point, that I had not left? I told myself it was duty. He said it carefully, like a man handling something he knows is going to break him. Obligation. That you stayed because you had no legal mechanism for leaving, that it meant nothing. And tonight. Tonight I was in my study and I could feel you working. His voice was rough. Through the bond, your focus, the particular quality of your mind when you are working on something with your whole attention. I have felt it for 5 years through every wall I put between us, and I have become so thoroughly familiar with the specific texture of you, from a distance, that I could tell when you picked up your quill and when you set it down, and I could feel the satisfaction when something resolved, and I could feel the frustration when it didn't. For 5 years I have been conducting an intimate acquaintance with your inner life entirely through the bond, from the West Wing, while telling myself I was maintaining appropriate distance. He exhaled, a long, unsteady exhale, the sound of pressure releasing. I could not do one more night of it. I stood with that for a moment. The rain, the coals, the bond like a sustained low note in everything. "Kalen," I said. He waited. He had gotten very good at waiting in his managed, structured way. I was realizing for the first time that what I had read as coldness might have been partly, at least, underneath, restraint. The restraint of a man who wanted very much to move towards something and had talked himself out of it every day for 5 years. "Sit down," I said. He blinked. Of all the things I might have said, this was not what he had prepared for. "It is very late," I said, "and you are clearly not going back to your wing tonight. The fire has gone to coals. I am going to rebuild it, and you are going to sit down and you are going to tell me one true thing. After that we will see." A pause. Something in his face shifted, the last tension of it, the prepared for rejection set of his jaw, loosening into something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. "Only one," he said. "One to begin with. We have time." He sat. I rebuilt the fire. I had learned to do it myself in the second winter when the east wing had gone below freezing for 2 weeks, and I had decided I would rather be capable than dependent. The coals caught. The small logs caught. I sat across from him with both glasses filled from the decanter the night servant always left, always 2 glasses, which I had always thought was someone's small optimism, and handed him one. He took it. Our fingers did not quite touch. The bond registered the near miss with the attentiveness of a thing that has been waiting a long time for contact and has not lost patience. "One true thing," he said. "One true thing." He looked at the fire for a moment. "I have watched you build a life in the East Wing for 5 years," he said, "and I have been more proud of you than I have known what to do with and more ashamed of myself than I have told anyone." He paused. "There, that's true." I sat with it. "My turn," I said. He looked at me. "I stopped being angry at you around year 3, I said. "I started being curious instead, about what a man who ended a war and runs a court and manages everything with such precision was so specifically afraid of." I took a slow breath. "I think I understand it better now than I did an hour ago." "You understand more than I deserve." "That is probably true," I said, without cruelty. "But understanding isn't the same as excusing. Those are different things, and I want you to know I know the difference." He nodded. He was, underneath everything, a man capable of fine distinctions. I had always suspected this. "What happens now?" he asked. I looked at him, at the fire moving over his face, softening the angles, the exhaustion still present but something else present beside it. Something tentative and careful, like the first warmth showing through after a long cold. "Now," I said, "you stop retreating." He was very still. "I don't mean tonight," I said. "I mean that the arrangement changes. You stop using the West Wing and the managed distance and the protocols and the whole architecture of careful separation you have been maintaining to avoid landing. You have been falling from a very great height for 5 years, Kalen. It is time to land." "I don't know how to do that," he said quietly. "I want to be honest about that." "I know you don't. I'll show you." He stayed until the fire had burned down properly, and the rain had softened from insistent to murmur. We talked not about the large things, not about what had been lost or what might have been, those conversations that would need to happen eventually and would need time and space around them. We talked the way two people talk when they are learning the specific sound of each other's voice in a quiet room, what he had been reading, the border chiefs and what they were actually like in person before they became signatures on paper. A place in the northern highlands he had wanted to go before the war had reorganized everything, a particular river valley he had seen on a map and filed away, a place I had wanted to see, once, before the bond had reorganized everything for me. He laughed genuinely, not the controlled sound he produced in formal settings, and I felt it move through the bond like light through water, warm and diffuse, and I looked at the fire rather than his face, because some things you have to approach from an angle at first. He asked me about the water rights dispute. I told him what I had concluded. He listened with the concentrated attention of someone who is actually processing what is said rather than waiting for the space where they can respond, and when I finished he said, "The penalty clause framework is right. The seasonal provisions are the harder sell. You'll need the Calloway family to believe the provision protects their historical access rather than curtailing it. The language will need to lead with that." I looked at him. I know you know, he said. "I'm agreeing with you." It was such a specific and ordinary thing, to be agreed with by the man who held the seal, on work I had done, that I did not know immediately what to do with it. I filed it. I would process it later. When he finally stood to leave, because there were forms still, walls not demolished in a single night but honestly examined and marked for future work, he paused in the doorway. The same doorway where he had stood 5 years ago with his formal speech and his careful eyes, and the expression of a man completing a sentence he had begun in a dream he could not recall. He looked at me now, with nothing rehearsed anywhere on his face. "Tomorrow," he said, "breakfast." Breakfast, the smallest, most ordinary of things. The thing I had done alone for 4 years, 9 months and 6 days. "Tomorrow," I said. He left. His footsteps down the corridor were different from the ones that had arrived. Some quality in them had changed. Some weight that had been present on arrival was now distributed differently. The sound of a man who has set something down. I stood in the open doorway of the east wing and listened until I could no longer hear them. He came to breakfast. I had told myself during the night, which I had not slept much of, not to hope too specifically, that a man does not dismantle 5 years of discipline in a single evening and arrive in the morning reorganized. That there would be setbacks, silences, the long careful work of two people learning, late and under complicated conditions, how to be known by each other. He came 3 minutes before the hour, which I had learned to read as a form of language. 3 minutes early meant something had been decided before he arrived. He came with his crown and his formal coat, and he looked at me across the small breakfast table in the East Wing morning room, as if the room's familiar dimensions were insufficient for everything he was carrying, and he had decided to carry it anyway. "You rebuilt the fire yourself," he said. "I told you I did." "I know I'm not," he sat down. "I'm noticing it, the way I'm noticing everything in this room, how it runs, how you run it." He looked at me steadily. "How long have you been managing the East Wing staffing independently, without directing it through the main household?" "Year 2. Something moved through his eyes that I did not rush to interpret. "The Callaway Lands Treaty," he said, "and the Marin River Boundary Agreement, and the Thornfield Grazing Rights Document." I said nothing. "Archivist Holt told me," he said. "I asked him to pull the original drafts of 3 recent agreements and review the language. He told me the prose style changed in year 3. He said the new style was better, more precise, less susceptible to misreading by parties arguing in bad faith." His voice was even, but the words had cost something to say. He said someone had begun writing these with the specific knowledge of how regional disputes actually work, rather than how they are theoretically supposed to work. He did not know who. And you guessed. I did not have to guess. I knew your handwriting from the East Wing reports. He paused. You have been doing the work of 2 people for 3 years, under my seal, without acknowledgement. The work needed doing, I said. I could do it. That was sufficient. Zero. If you are going to tell me it was improper. I am not. He leaned forward, both forearms on the table, the formal bearing gone. I am trying to tell you that I have been in the West Wing believing I was containing my own inadequacy, protecting the court from a mate who could not function as one, and the entire time you were here working more than adequately for both of us, doing it quietly, without asking for anything. He exhaled. I had told myself you were surviving. I find that you were governing. I looked at him for a long moment. I was building what was available to me, I said. I would have preferred to build it with you. Since you were not available, I built it alone. This is not a moral claim. It is simply what happened. He held my gaze. I understand that. I am not asking for credit for understanding it. I am asking if it is too late to be available now. The morning light was coming through the east windows. The light that I had claimed for myself in year 1. The particular quality of it that I had never described to anyone, because there had been no one to describe it to. It moved across the breakfast things between us, across the cups and the bread and the ordinary geometry of a shared table. It is not too late, I said. The weeks that followed were the work of it, not the drama of it, the work. There were mornings when he came to breakfast and we sat in comfortable quiet, both reading, not speaking, and learning that this was not failure. That occupying the same silence was a different skill from filling it, and one worth developing. There were evenings when the bond registered something difficult in him, border dispatches, a death in the Northern Territories, a council vote that had gone the wrong way, and I had to learn to sit with that without rushing to resolve it, to acknowledge without fixing, to be present without having answers. There were moments when his old reflexes moved through him, and the managed distance assembled itself again without his permission, like a wall that has been partially dismantled, but remembers its original configuration. I learned to recognize those moments without anger. He learned to name them. I am doing the closing thing, he said once, across a late supper, after he had gone half quiet in the middle of a sentence. I noticed. I know I'm doing it. I haven't figured out how to stop the reflex. You noticed it, I said. That's not small. He looked at me. It is small. Noticing is how it changes, I said. That's all I know. He was quiet for a moment. I am trying to tell you something. I'm here. What he told me about the dispatch from the Northern Post, about the village, the children, the specific weight of decisions made in his name that he carried in the way a person carries something too heavy to set down and too constant to stop noticing, came out in pieces, over 2 hours, over the dying of the fire. I did not offer comfort in advance of what he actually needed. I waited and listened and found out what he needed, which was to be heard rather than reassured, to have what he said received rather than processed into something more manageable. What do you need? I asked eventually. He considered it seriously. Company just here, not talking, not, he paused, just someone in the room who already knows. That I can do. We sat by the fire in the West Wing study, his study, which I had been invited to and had been accepting the invitation to until well past the second bell. Not talking. The bond between us steady and low, a sustained note in the stone of the room, patient. 3 months after the night he came to my door, he moved the morning briefings to the East Wing. Not by formal declaration. He simply arrived with his chief of staff and his correspondents, settled at the long table in the morning room and began working. I was already there. We worked in parallel for 3 hours in the room that caught the best light in the castle, and his chief of staff, Holtren, who was a woman of practical mind and efficient adaptation, passed documents between us without comment, because she had clearly already recalibrated. At noon he looked up from a supply calculation and said, "This room's light is better than my study." "Your study faces north," I said. He looked at the windows, then at me. "I didn't know that." "You hadn't been here before." He absorbed this. The south gallery would work better for afternoon sessions. It would. He went back to the calculation. I went back to mine. Whole trend passed another document without expression. Outside, early spring was beginning to suggest itself in the courtyard, not arrived yet, but possible. He arrived at the Treaty Commission meeting the following week with my name added to the formal member list. I found out when I sat down, and the commission chair handed me a copy of the amended charter, my signature block already printed at the bottom in the official typeface. I looked at it for a moment. He was watching me from across the table. "I should have done it in year one," he said, quietly enough that only I could hear. "You should have," I said. "I know. I will not say it's fine. I'm not asking you to." The commission meeting proceeded. I made 4 contributions, 2 of which changed the direction of the discussion. He watched me with the expression he wore when he was recalculating, not surprised exactly, but attentive in the specific way of someone updating a model. One evening in late spring, I was sitting at the window of the West Wing study, with the correspondence from the week spread between us, and the bond gave me something I did not immediately have a word for. Not happiness, exactly, too exact and active a word. Something quieter and older. The sensation of a system that has been running compensatory processes for so long it has forgotten what baseline function feels like, suddenly finding the compensations unnecessary. The particular relief of a thing working as designed. I looked up. Kalen was watching me from across the study, and his face was carrying everything. 5 years of wasted mornings, and the second bell in the corridor, and every breakfast since, and the specific quality of someone who has stopped managing what they feel about what they are looking at. "What?" I said. "Nothing," he said, then more honestly, everything. I set down my pen. "Come here," I said. He came. He sat beside me at the window, close enough that our shoulders rested against each other. The first time in 5 years we had been in the same room, and not maintained the careful geometry of appropriate distance. Outside, the spring evening was doing things to the courtyard gardens. The first green coming through, the training ground lamps just lit, the eastern gate torches throwing long gold lines across the old stone. The bond between us was the steadiest it had ever been, not pulling, not aching, not a signal of something unresolved, simply present the way something is present when it has found its proper frequency and ceased to require adjustment. "I was so certain," he said quietly, "that I would damage you. And instead..." He looked at me. His face was the face of a man who has finally, after a very long fall, found the ground and discovered that it was not what he had feared, that it held. "Instead," he said, "you rebuilt us both." I thought about cables connected in the dark, about a system running its own recovery process, patient and methodical, in a wing it had been given rather than chosen, about the specific courage of a man who had been shutting himself down for so long that opening up had become genuinely terrifying, walking down a corridor in bare feet at the second bell to knock on a door he should have knocked on 5 years ago. "You knocked first," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I did." That was the important thing. Everything else followed from that. The spring evening settled around us. Somewhere in the castle, the second bell had not yet rung. We had time, not infinite time, not the impossible time of stories, but real time, the kind with mornings in it and correspondence and the particular satisfactions of difficult work, done well and someone in the room who already knows. Kalen Voss placed his hand over mine on the window seat, unhurried, no ceremony. He did not say anything. After 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days, the mate bond finally sounded the way it was made to sound. Not like an ache, not like a system alarm, not like the persistent signal of something kept apart from what it was designed to reach. Like a door opened from both sides at once. Like the quiet, unmistakable sensation of a thing that has been waiting a very long time, finally arriving home. There is a particular kind of reckoning that happens to a person when something they have been refusing to feel finally arrives fully. Not in the single dramatic moment. That is only the door opening. The reckoning is everything that comes after in the ordinary days, when the feelings walk in and find the furniture rearranged and have to learn where they live now. I had my version of this. It arrived on a morning in the 4th month, when I was walking through the East Wing doing the weekly review of the household accounts, a task I had performed every week for 5 years. It was a habit built into my bones by then. The particular route through the rooms, the way I stopped at each door and listened for the quality of the silence inside, the morning light through the narrow passage window between the library and the storerooms, which hit the stone at a certain angle and made it look almost warm. I did it the same way I always did it, and somewhere in the passage between the library and the storerooms, in the ordinary amber light, I understood with sudden and complete clarity that I had loved him for years. Not the bond, not the biological pull of the mate bond, which was present always and not the same thing. Something that had developed alongside the bond and in spite of everything, in the specific way things develop in difficult soil, slowly, stubbornly, with the particular determination of a thing that grows not because conditions are good, but because growing is what it does. I had watched him through walls and in council chambers and across formal tables, and I had read him in dispatches and in the handwriting on documents, and in the quality of the silence the bond sent me on hard mornings, and somewhere in all of that I had built, without permission, a comprehensive and inconvenient attachment. I stood in the passage for a moment with the account ledger under my arm. Then I continued the review, because the accounts still needed reviewing, and I had learned long ago that feelings did not pause the work, and the work did not resolve the feelings, and both were simply true simultaneously. I did not tell him that day. I told him, eventually, the way I had come to do most things with him, directly, without theater, in the middle of an ordinary evening when we were both working in the South Gallery, and I set down my pen and said, "I want you to know that what I feel for you is not the bond." He looked up from his correspondence. "The bond has been present for 5 years, and I am not discounting it," I said, "but what I am saying is separate from that. I am saying that I watched you for 5 years, from a distance you maintained and I was not consulted about, and I built, without intending to and without wanting to, for a long time something that I would call love, the ordinary kind, the kind that develops through observation and accumulation and the specific stubbornness of a thing that refuses to stop growing despite difficult conditions." I picked up my pen again. "I thought you should know. You can respond or not. Either is acceptable." He was very still for a long moment. Then he said, "Sira." "Yes." "Look at me." I looked at him. "I have been in love with you," he said, with the directness of a man who has decided to be completely honest and has organized himself accordingly, since the first winter. Since I watched you manage the ice storm with the East Wing staff when the heating failed, and the reports came back saying you had organized the heating rotation yourself, and redistributed blankets from the storage rooms, and personally carried wood from the main supply when the footman slipped on the ice. I found out 3 days later. I sat with that information for 4 years and told myself it was admirable and it was nothing else, and I was very effective at lying to myself by then. He held my gaze. "It was not nothing else." I set the pen down again. "4 years," I said. "Yes." "You spent 4 years aware of that and still retreating," he said. "Yes, I am aware of how that sounds. I am not offering it as a justification. I am offering it as the truth because you told me the truth, and you deserve the same. I looked at him for a long moment across the south gallery table, with the late spring evening coming through the tall windows, and the work between us, and 5 years of managed distance behind us. I said. You were magnificent, he said, without hesitation. The heating failed at the second bell. By the fourth bell you had the whole east wing functional and warm, and you had somehow identified that the healer's stores were at risk, and moved them before the cold got into the lower rooms. I was told by the castle steward, who told me in the tone of a man reporting something extraordinary, that you had done all of this while maintaining the East Wing staff's morale through the simple method of working harder than anyone and not making it about yourself. It needed doing, I said, for the second time in our history. I know, he said, for the second time in our history. And I was in love with you by the end of that dispatch, and I filed it in the part of myself I had locked and continued to manage what I told myself was a purely administrative arrangement. The south gallery was quiet around us. The spring evening moved the light across the floor. We wasted a great deal of time, I said. Yes. I am not interested in wasting any more. No, he said. Neither am I. The summer arrived in the way of summers in the Northern Territories, abruptly, with complete conviction, as if winter had simply been persuaded out of the way by the accumulated warmth of enough consecutive good days. The castle changed with it. The East Wing morning room became almost too bright by the second hour of the day, and I started working in the South Gallery instead, which was where Kaelen had relocated the afternoon briefings, and which had become, by unspoken mutual decision, our shared working space. Shared, that word had weight in it, the weight of something that had been singular for a long time and was now, carefully and with full awareness of the work involved, becoming plural. The court had adjusted, as courts do. There had been comment, not to my face, but the court's conversational undercurrents had reached me, as they always did, through the channels of people who respected me enough to let me know what was being said. Most of the comment was positive, or at minimum curious rather than hostile. A small portion was resentful, which I understood. 5 years of one arrangement had produced its own settled expectations, and settled expectations do not thank you for disrupting them. I had attended 2 formal dinners as Kaelen's acknowledged partner rather than the ceremonially present but functionally separate mate of previous years, and both times I had sat at his right hand and spoken when I had something to say, and not made any particular performance of the change. The people at those tables who mattered had understood. The people who did not matter had made of it what they wished. Thessaly, the court healer, had found me in the East Wing library on the morning after the first of those dinners. You look different, she said, sitting down across from me without ceremony. I'm not sure what you mean. You look like someone who has stopped holding something very heavy at arm's length. She poured herself tea from the pot between us with the ease of a woman accustomed to helping herself. You've been doing that since year 1, holding it out at arm's length and pretending it didn't weigh anything. I looked at her. I say this, she said, as someone who has observed the East Wing for 5 years and maintained a strictly professional silence about its more complex emotional architecture, because that was what was needed. She took a sip of tea. And because you are one of the most competent people in this castle, and I was rooting for you even when I was being professionally silent about it. I said, you are remarkably forthright for someone who has been professionally silent. The professional silence is over, she said. Something has changed. I am observing it. I am allowed to observe it. I considered her for a moment. Then I said, the healer store's relocation during the ice storm in year 1. She looked at me. Did you report that to the castle steward? A pause. I may have mentioned it in the course of a general post-incident review. That report reached the Alpha King. She was quiet for a moment, then she said with great composure, I thought it should. I looked at her for a long time. She met my look with the equanimity of a woman who has done exactly what she meant to do and is at peace with it. Thank you, I said. You're welcome. She took another sip of tea. I did the same thing with the treaty language observations, by the way. I mentioned your drafting style to Archivist Holt during a records consultation, casually, 3 months ago. I said Thessaly. You were doing extraordinary work, she said calmly. In an inappropriate amount of obscurity, I made a decision. I looked at her, she looked at me. The East Wing library was warm and bright with summer light, and somewhere in the rest of the castle, work was ongoing and the day was continuing, and the bond was a steady and present note in everything, no longer the signal of something unresolved. I'm glad you did, I said. She smiled. I know, she said, that's why I told you. On the last evening of the summer, Kaylin and I walked the grounds together at dusk. This had become a habit without becoming a routine, the distinction being that a habit is something you return to because it serves you, and a routine is something you perform because it is expected. We walked when the day had been long, and the South Gallery had given us everything it had to give, and there was still something that needed processing that was better done in motion and in open air. We walked the full circuit of the inner grounds, from the training ground along the north wall, through the kitchen gardens, around the edge of the formal garden where the summer roses were finally going over, past the eastern gate and back. It was approximately 20 minutes if you walked without stopping. We stopped that evening at the eastern gate, where the torches were just being lit by the gate guard, who nodded at us both with the specific comfortable familiarity of a man who has seen something change and has updated accordingly. Outside the gate, the approach road ran down through the old stand of ash trees that gave Ashenvale its name. In the dusk, the trees were going to silhouette, the last light running amber along the tops of them. The air smelled of late summer and cooling stone, and somewhere distantly of the hay harvest from the southern fields. What are you thinking about? Kaylin asked. The eastern approach, I said. The ash trees. I've been here 5 years and I've only walked this path twice. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll walk it with you properly tomorrow. Good, I paused. What are you thinking about? He was quiet in the way he was quiet, when he was being honest about something, rather than processing what to say. I am thinking, he said, about the specific form that relief takes when you have been wrong about something for a very long time and you finally understand how wrong you were. Not guilt, not regret, something more physical than that, like a structure that has been holding a load it wasn't designed for, and the load has finally been redistributed correctly. I looked at him in the dusk. The torchlight at the gate was making warm patterns on his face. He was looking out at the ash trees. We don't get the 5 years back, I said. No. But we have what comes after. Yes, he turned. He looked at me with the evening behind him and the gate torches lighting us both and the bond between us, the sound of a system that has found its proper steady state, quiet and complete, and no longer asking for anything because everything is already present. We have a considerable amount of what comes after, if we're careful with it. We'll be careful with it, I said. He extended his hand. I took it. The first time in 5 years that contact had been chosen and not managed. The first time the distance had been closed by both of us at once. The bond recognized it the way a system recognizes a correct input after a long sequence of errors. Quietly, without ceremony, the specific satisfying click of a thing finding its configuration. We stood at the eastern gate of Ashenvale as the dusk went to dark, the ash trees becoming pure silhouette, the first stars appearing above the north tower. The summer was ending. What came next was what it had always been going to be if either of us had been brave enough to reach for it sooner, but this was when it arrived. An arrival is arrival, regardless of the detour. I had once been afraid that love in this place would be something that happened to me rather than something I chose. Something imposed by the bond, by the title, by the architecture of duty and royalty that had landed me in an East Wing I had not asked for. Standing at the gate in the dark with his hand in mine and 5 years of built-up capability behind me, I understood that I had been wrong about that and right about something else. That the choice had been mine all along. That I had been choosing every day, in every letter and every file and every carefully rebuilt fire, to stay, to build, to make something real out of the available materials. The choice had not required his participation to be genuine. It had simply been waiting for the moment he was ready to make one too. He had come to my door in bare feet at the second bell and knocked. Everything else had followed from that. There is one more thing. A few weeks after the summer ended, I was reorganizing the East Wing Library, a task I had been meaning to do for 2 years and had finally appointed myself the afternoon to complete, when I found, on the bottom shelf behind a collection of old survey maps, a stack of dispatches that had been misfiled there, probably during the ice storm reorganization in year 1, when everything in the East Wing had been moved to protect it from the cold. They were addressed to me, official dispatches to the Lady of the East Wing, as my formal title then ran, dated across the whole of year 1, weather reports, seasonal supply estimates. Standard administrative correspondence, the kind that would have helped me understand the Eastern territories I nominally managed, the kind that would have made my first year of petitioner sessions considerably easier. Misfiled, no one's fault most likely, an ice storm and a disorganized relocation and the particular chaos of a difficult winter. But at the bottom of the stack, underneath the administrative dispatches, there was one that was different. It was addressed in his handwriting. I recognized it immediately. I had seen it on 5 years of documents, on the formal treaty seals, on the bottom of the morning briefing notes he now left for me when he was in the North Wing before I arrived. His handwriting was distinctive, spare, unhurried, every letter fully formed but none of them elaborate. It was addressed to me, Sira, Lady of the East Wing. The date was the 2nd month of year 1, 2 months after I had arrived. The letter inside was half a page. It said, "I have been told by multiple members of staff that you have been working in the East Wing morning room from the 5th bell each day. I know this room. It has the best morning light in the castle. I thought you should know that I noticed you chose it. The East Wing Library has a gap on the 3rd shelf, where a set of Northern Territorial histories should be. They were moved to my study during the Eastern Annex renovation and never returned. If you want them, they're yours. Tell the head librarian to collect them from my study any morning. I hope Ashenvale is treating you well." That was all. I read it twice. He had written this in the 2nd month. He had noticed the morning room. He had known about the histories. He had written this and then filed it somewhere that was not my desk, or given it to someone who misfiled it in the ice storm, or lost it in the winter chaos. It had sat behind the survey maps for 5 years. I carried it to the South Gallery. He was at the far end of the table when I came in, reviewing the autumn border schedules, and he looked up with the particular focus of a man who was in the middle of a calculation and was briefly emerging from it. I set the letter on the table in front of him. He looked at it. A long, still moment. He recognized his own handwriting. "The ice storm," he said quietly. "Probably," I said. "It was with a stack of first-year administrative dispatches that were misfiled in the East Wing Library. I found them this afternoon." He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the letter, at the handwriting, at the date in the top corner. "I wrote this," he said, "and then I did not deliver it. I told myself it was inappropriate, that it was reaching toward the thing I was not permitting myself to reach toward." He paused. "I had given it to the footman for delivery and then called him back. And it ended up in the library. And it ended up in the library." He looked at me. The expression on his face was the rarest one I had seen on him, not composed, not controlled, simply open with the particular honesty of someone who has run out of ways to manage what they feel. "The Northern Territorial histories are still in my study," he said. "I kept them there. I used to, when the library reports came back saying you'd read another section, I would," he stopped. "I would check which volume and read ahead." I looked at him. "You read ahead?" I said. "Yes." "For 5 years?" "Yes." He held my gaze. I did not know what to do with what I felt, so I did what I could do without crossing the line I had drawn. "I read the books you were reading. I knew what you were thinking about. It was the nearest I permitted myself to," he exhaled, "to being near you." I thought about that, about the bond that registered me through walls, about the man in the West Wing who had read ahead in the books I was reading, who had written a letter in year 1 and then called back the footman, about the specific form courage takes when it is rationed very carefully and spent in very small and private ways. "The letter was a beginning," I said. "It was meant to be." "It still is," I said. I picked up the letter and folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of my working gown. He watched me do this. Something in his face settled into an expression I had no old name for but was learning a new one, the expression of a man who has stopped bracing for the worst and started, quietly, learning to believe in something different. "I am going to keep it," I said. "Good," he said. "And the Northern Territorial histories. I want the ones I haven't read yet." "You can have all of them." "I know," I said. "I've known for a while." I sat down at the far end of the table and picked up the work I had brought. He returned to his border schedules. The South Gallery was warm with autumn light and the particular quiet of 2 people doing separate things in the same room, the specific, unremarkable, entirely necessary quiet of a shared life. Outside, Ashenvale was going to autumn. The ash trees along the eastern approach were turning. In a few weeks they would be bare and then winter would come again, the kind that settled in and stayed, and I would rebuild fires in the West Wing as I had learned to in the East, and we would work through the cold months with the account books and the treaty files and the correspondence from the border chiefs between us. And none of it would be what I had imagined, at 22, arriving in a hall where a king looked at me as if I were a battle he was already losing. It would be better than that. It would be real.